Hi, I'm Len Rydell, Executive Director of the Blue and Gray Education Society. I'd like to welcome you to another lecture in the North and the Civil War Symposium held at Massachusetts School of Law in October of 2003. Our next speaker, you've already heard me introduce him, is Herman Hattaway. When you bring somebody from Kansas City, you work them hard for their food, and Herman didn't mind giving extra talks as long as we kept him for the whole symposium. He had an opportunity to go out and look for good food, and in Massachusetts that was lobster and clam chowder and things like that. And so Herman was all in for a second lecture, and I asked him to wrap up the series of lectures here by talking about Abraham Lincoln and evaluating him as the Commander-in-Chief. A very interesting thematic twist, because Lincoln has so many responsibilities, and I think that people never really full realize the ramifications of the Constitution, because we had never really put a president in a significant role as the, quote, commander-in-chief. Madison, smaller role, but not of a massive scale. Lincoln defines the role, and I think that most people would appreciate, as we had Justice Williams talk about earlier in the symposium about Lincoln and civil rights. When you look and compare all these together, you realize that there is a huge amount of accountability that we just haven't full well gotten our hands around. And I think that's probably why, when you go look at the literature of Abraham Lincoln in the Blue and Gray Library, for example, I've got some 6 shelves of Lincoln stuff and related to Lincoln. So that's 30 book feet. That's probably the best part of 300 books on Lincoln. So there's so much about the Lincoln presidency, as short as it was, that needs evaluation, that I think focusing on Lincoln and his specifically and unique role as Commander-in-Chief was well worth our effort, and I think you will agree. So sit back, relax, enjoy Herman Hattaway. As I mentioned yesterday before, Herman Hattaway is a man of a multitude of talents, and is one of the best written and most significant scholars of the past 25 years or so. So it's a real pleasure to have him in this final talk of the period and of this conference, talking about Lincoln as a Commander-in-Chief. Herman.
Thank you very much. I served in the military before I entered professional academe, and early in the latter, I was very surprised to discover that there was a very similar degree of backbiting, self-promotion, and ass-kissing. And I strongly suspect that may be true in all organizations and business endeavors and so forth. It's even true in the Boy Scouts, if you can believe that. I'm 51 years now, actually, in the Boy Scouts of America. We were talking yesterday about what if that bullet had entered Lincoln's head a little while earlier than it did, and I had thought since then, well, of course, if it had been before early November 1864, the President of the United States would have been Hannibal Hamlin of Maine, and he may not have been up to the task. I vividly remember reading a review of a then new biography of Hannibal Hamlin, and the review was written by David Donald, Professor Chesson's major professor. And he said, this is an altogether adequate biography of an altogether forgettable vice president. Professor Vell is, Dean Vell is reading a book on the origin of aphorisms, and I happen to use one of my favorite driving over here about people being too poor to have a pot to pee in. Another that I like is war is hell. You know, this is one of William Tecumseh Sherman's two most famous sayings. The other is, if nominated, I will not run. If elected, I will not serve. And that was when they were trying to get him to be the candidate for the President of the United States. But you might be interested to know the origin of war is hell. Far behind the lines one night, the Coterie of Union generals were playing cards, and someone suggested that they play war, children's game. And Kump said, no, no, no. Oh, come on, Kump, don't you know what war is? Well, yes, I know what war is. Hell, I just don't want to play. Who is it? Douglas MacArthur, famous for saying, I shall return. He was gathering up his things to get the hell out of there, and somebody reminded him he had a book checked out from the library. And he, oh yes, I shall return this book on the way out of here. We're talking about Sickles during the Brooks Simpson presentation. You know, they called him Sickles the Incredible. And I think one of the reasons, of course, was because of that really ridiculous forward salient that he pushed his people in to very precarious place, far too forward at Gettysburg. But he lost a leg at Gettysburg. And I think actually I've seen it. That leg it was put on display at the, whatever, the American Chief Military Medical Facility, whatever. And he liked, Walter Reed, he liked to go every now and then and pay a visit to his leg. That's fascinating, isn't it? He must have been weird. Now, it's very interesting that my fellow Southerner, Michael Chesson, newly discovered friend, talks about Southerners and how they feel. Do you know what the definition of a happy Southerner is? A happy Southerner is one who has two guns in the pickup. We all have one. Friendly fire isn't. I was sharing a table at a Phi Alpha Theta luncheon, that's the professional historians organization, with Colonel Robert Doty, who is the head, and long time now, head of the history department at the U.S. Military Academy. And I said in idle conversation that I bet 25% of the casualties that the military has taken has been by friendly fire. And he said, oh, I bet it's higher than that. And I did a little research, and who knows if these people know for sure what they're talking about. Look at how many different opinions various historians have concerning the casualties in 7 days. But what I was able to find by looking up is that it's 27% of all the casualties that we've taken have been by friendly fire. Well, now, let us look ahead briefly to the in-game Union strategy in 1864. And Grant is not going to become a paraplegic, much as many of us Southerners would have liked. And Lincoln is not going to take that bullet in the head early. So we have then U.S. Grant facing Robert E. Lee in what really is a gigantic holding action. What Grant primarily wants to do is keep Lee pinned down, push him on rearward if possible. Of course, what happens is that Grant assaults and in essence is defeated, but unlike his predecessors who would all retreat and scamper away, Grant sidles off to the flank and pushes forward. And this happens in a series of episodes until they get on down to the vicinity of Petersburg, where the Confederate Army takes up what proved to be fairly strong defensive positions, and the siege is going to last almost 9 months. But Grant wants to keep Lee from doing what he had in fact done just before the Confederate triumph at Chickamauga, which is to dispatch some troops to the Western Theater to achieve something spectacular there. And then meanwhile, at simultaneous advance, the great principle of simultaneous advance, William Tecumseh Sherman, first against Joseph Eggleston Johnston, and then subsequently against John Bell Hood, and then subsequently against virtually nobody, is going to thrust the knockout blow. He is going to achieve the knockout thrust. That's the great story of the endgame Union strategy of the Civil War. The war is won in the West, but it's won in the West because in the East, Lee is pinned down, immobilized. Lee knew that it would be inevitable that he would lose a siege, but maybe he could hang on long enough that the war weariness factor would weigh in. Northern people would decide that it's going to cost too much and it's lasting too long and it just isn't worth it. When exactly did Lee change his mind? We are not sure, but recent scholarship has shed some fresh light on this, and in fact it's Jack Davis, I believe, a study of the end game. There were several books a couple of 3 years ago that came out about the end game. Did you do one too? Anyway, there's several books about the end game that came out a couple of years ago. And Jack Davis did one of them, and it has to do with the guy from Kentucky coming in to become the last of the 5 secretaries of war, John C. Breckinridge. And Breckinridge, according to Davis, is credited. Also that guy, Jay Winkler, is it, the April 1865 winning? Why was it that things turned out as well as they did in the end? Because can't you imagine how horrible they would have been if the Confederates had in fact resorted to guerrilla warfare? And say it had gone on another 10, 20, or 30 years, or maybe even the ultimate balkanization of the United States, or the Irishization of the United States. It could have happened, but it didn't. These scholars credit Breckinridge with wanting to negotiate as well as possible a decent peace. And Lee, from time to time, came in from Petersburg to confer with various officials in Richmond, and in February of '65, Lee had a conference with Breckinridge during which they apparently mutually agreed that the South was going to lose, and that what they had better do is try to get out as well as possible. Now, of course, month after next will render my most recent book, not what is now my most recent book, because I have one coming out in December, but my most recent book, and co-authored with Richard Berenger, is Jefferson Davis, Confederate President, which, by God, should have won for me a 3rd Jefferson Davis Award. And I had assured Berenger that it would, but it didn't. I do have 2 of them, and Berenger has 1 because our conjoint book Why the South Lost the Civil War, won a Jefferson Davis Award. I also won one for my first book, the biography of Stephen D. Lee. I don't think I told you this one yesterday. I hope not. I'm going to tell it now. Let's see, Lee came out in 76. So in 77, I traveled from Kansas City to Richmond, Virginia to accept my first of what has proved to be 2 Jefferson Davis Awards. And I started my pattern of modus operandi then that I have continued and will continue to continue. When somebody else is paying, go as early as you can and stay as long as you can. And see and do as much as you can and have as good a time as you can. So in addition to touring Hollywood Cemetery, where the Davis funeral plot is in Richmond, and also James Stewart, who is buried right next to a famous female Southern author.
Ellen Glasgow.
Yeah, Ellen Glasgow. I need all this, see, my retrieval system isn't working as well as it once did. I know all this stuff, but I have trouble dredging it up. Well, so among other things, I wandered into the house where Mrs. Lee had lived during the war, which at that time, and may still as far as I know, the United Daughters of the Confederacy had a bookstore. And this was right shortly after Thomas Lawrence Conley Jr.'s publication, The Marble Man, which is a bit critical of Robert E. Lee. And I looked around and there wasn't any of that for sale, and I commented how strange I thought it was. And this lady said, "Oh, that awful man. We can't help it that the war, after all, was fought in Virginia." Well, you know, a lot of Virginians think it was. But in fact, less than 21%, over 20 and less than 21% of the battle actions occurred in Virginia. So the war was fought in Virginia partially, but it was fought in a lot of other places too. Now back to Lee and Breckinridge, who early on have decided that they're not going to win and maybe they'd better try to negotiate as decent a peace as they can. Jefferson Davis was in delusion. That's my conclusion in that rather big book, Jefferson Davis, Confederate President, that in the last months of the Civil War, by golly, poor Jefferson Davis was mentally deluded. He
Surprised not to win the prize?
Yeah, right. I was surprised not to win the prize. But that might explain it.
Who's mentally deluded now?
Well, you know me very well, don't you? Well, that probably does explain it. Come to think of it. I hadn't thought of that.
You learn something every day.
Yeah.
To give you the prize.
That's right, that's right. Because Davis believed, but now listen to this, because actually this, if you really grok what I'm trying to say here, now if you don't know what that means, the science fiction writer Robert Heinlein in the book Stranger in a Strange Land has this guy that grew up on Mars, but he finds himself back on Earth for some reason, and he has trouble grokking people that he meets. Now, grok means to so completely understand someone or something that it almost becomes a part of you and you a part of it. So if you can grok this, Davis believed not that guerrilla warfare would be necessary. And see, there's a historiographical split here. There are a lot of good scholars that do assert in their work that Davis wanted a guerrilla struggle. No, Davis was in delusion and believed that somehow, if he could just some way get himself physically into the proximity of some more Confederate troops, they could continue the war by conventional operations. He believed that. He was wrong, of course, but he believed it. And he tried. And we're talking about the moving of the capital. You talked about yesterday, somebody talked about the moving of the capital of the the Confederation, which became the United States several times. Well, by golly, the Confederates first moved their capital from Richmond to Danville, Virginia, and then down into North Carolina, and then down into South Carolina, reestablishing literally a pseudo capital every time, every place. And then finally, in Irwin, or not in, but near Irwinville, Georgia, Davis, who had incidentally reunited with his wife at that point. They had left Richmond separately. She had gone first, but he had finally met up with her, was captured. Now, we ask a great deal of our presidents. We demand that they be civilians. If, as in the case of Dwight Eisenhower, they are on active duty when elected to the presidency, they have to resign that commission while they serve as president. Usually, Congress restores the commission after they leave the office, but they have to be civilians. And yet, they are in the chain of command. They are at the top thereof. They are Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of the United States. They salute, and they return salutes. Some people reasonably well, like Jimmy Carter. Some people asininely, like that jerk from Arkansas, Clinton. Bill Clinton, very lousy saluter.
Good at other things.
Well, I don't know what, except taking blowjobs. Was it you or the other guy that said I would be ridden off your campus on a rail? If it was the other guy, huh? Your Chesson, and it was Klein last night at the party, said if I was at his school, they would run me off on a rail. I told him, I said, well, you know, I was more or less forced into retirement as it was.
Make sure you edit that transcript, Larry.
Now,
Cut off the 2 words.
he has to work with a multitude of people, sometimes individuals with personalities that clash or disharmonies with his. And certainly we'll find as we look at the Civil War that that's a big difference between Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis. Davis cannot work well with people that he knows dislike him, and Lincoln can. And that's a really interesting and valuable quality, to be able to work well with people that you know don't like you. But Lincoln could do that. Thomas A. Bailey, who made a study of presidential greatness, said the American people admire a chieftain who can command their allegiance, unite the sections, placate factions, and inspire the people to greater patriotism and arouse them with a challenge that will appeal to their better selves. And indeed, all of that Abraham Lincoln did to an exemplary degree. As I think it says in one of my blurbs, if the Civil War was the first modern war, then by golly, Abraham Lincoln was the first modern president. He was certainly the first president of the United States to have to deal with a very large and very complex war, and one that was not easy to win. And so it was crucial that he learn a lot of things about how to be commander-in-chief, and he did that and did it very well. He mastered conventional 19th century military strategy. He came to understand and he learned how to interact with the better thinking of his West Point trained officers. He and these generals insightfully analyzed operations. They believed correctly in the superiority of the defense over the offense. And why was that? Because of the tremendous added power by firepower, and especially so after the empirical discovery that cover and concealment were desirable, which, you know, it took them a long time to learn, but at least they did finally learn it. At which point it really made the defense a lot more powerful than the offense. Lincoln shouldered full responsibility for making and seeing to the execution of strategic plans, and these plans were sufficient to bring victory. And he got these ideas primarily from his generals, but also from his prescient observations of military realities as the war wore on. It is very significant that Lincoln's military ideas were both realistic and workable. And McClellan is, my major professor, T. Harry Williams, he could come up with bemusing bon mots from time to time. He opened his biography of Beauregard as, he was the most colorful of all the Confederate generals. That semi-inspired me to open my biography of Stephen D. Lee as, he was the dullest of all the Confederate generals. But McClellan, according to my major professor, T. R. Williams, was the problem child of the Civil War. And in many respects, because the way he's been treated in historiography, he still is. I think most people think McClellan's not very good. Ethan Refuse, whom I'm going to be happy to inform that you said was a very fine historian, is also my doctoral offspring, number 2, has a work on McClellan. It's his revised doctoral dissertation that the Indiana University Press is contracted to publish. And I'm sure that that book is going to lift McClellan's image up a little bit, because unlike Stephen Sears, who is probably the leading McClellan scholar these days, Refuse is pro-McClellan and Sears is anti-McClellan. In fact, Sears not only sears McClellan in his biographical study, he screws McClellan, he shafts McClellan, he stacks the deck in the edited edition of McClellan's papers. He picks out the ones that make McClellan look the worst and leaves out the ones that make him look a little bit better. Well, Lincoln learned a lot early on from McClellan, and they talked a lot. And from McClellan, Lincoln derived the fundamental essence of his concept. Why the North, with her great armies, so often faced the South in battle with inferiority of numbers. And the president said, the enemy hold the interior lines and we have the exterior lines. Now, you understand this? If you say you've got an elliptical defense and you're behind that ellipsis, there's shorter lines on the inside than there are on the outside. The exterior lines are longer, the interior lines are shorter. So you can move more people more rapidly to redeploy and face a threat. So what he said we need to do is to use the turning movement whenever we can to get in the enemy's rear and to intercept his line of retreat. And then ultimately, of course, the principle of simultaneous advance, which would be how they would counter the enemy ability to use interior lines for strategic redeployment. Early on, he explained that his general idea of the war was, we have the greater numbers and the enemy has the greater ability to concentrate forces upon points of collision. We must therefore fail unless we can find some way of making our advantage an overmatch for his, and this can be done by menacing him with superior forces at different points at the same time, so that we can safely attack one or both if he makes no change. And if he weakens one to strengthen the other, forbear to attack the strengthened one, but seize and hold the weakened one, gaining so much. So this principle of simultaneous advance is actually quite brilliant, and it is the great key to the ultimate Union victory. And he also had the idea early on that taking places was not the primary goal. The primary goal was defeating enemy forces in the field. And he kept trying to tell his generals that, to think more about defeating an enemy force than taking an enemy city. And it took him a long time to find enough generals that would agree with him on that and would go for that. Now, 2, To facilitate his change of emphasis and to increase the odds, he concluded that it would in fact be best to fight Lee and his army as far away from Richmond as possible. If we cannot beat him, Lincoln said, when he bears the wastage of coming to us, we can never beat him when we bear the wastage of going to him. And of course, Lee, if he's far away from his base, has what we call long lines of communication and of course supply. And in coming to us, he tenders us to an advantage which we should not waive. The president, realizing that an outright defeat of Lee was unlikely early in the war, that engaging Lee in battle would give the immediate benefit of preventing him from reinforcing other Southern armies elsewhere. Now, abandoning the idea of sensational attacks against Richmond and settling on repeated, if marginal, blows against Lee's forces, Lee, and by that time Henry W. Halleck, Lincoln's military advisor. That's fascinating. See, he brings Halleck in not long after the Shiloh campaign to be general-in-chief, but Halleck actually functions more as chief of staff than he does as general-in-chief, and that's very beneficial to the Union war effort. And so the two of them together worked to try to guide the serial commanders of the Army of the Potomac to adopt the unconventional and unpromising objective of hitting the Army instead of giving primary emphasis to taking Richmond. Now, Lieutenant General Winfield Scott, that would be Brevet Lieutenant General Winfield Scott, bred by honorary. No one since George Washington had actually had the official rank of Lieutenant General. That's 3 stars. So it's a bit complicated. It makes the Union command system at the general grade level complicated, because until Grant gets a 3rd star, there are only brigadiers, that's 1 star, and major generals, 2 stars, whereas in the Confederate Army, there are from the outset 4 different grades of general officers, and it makes it more sane and rational. Incidentally, and this is sort of an aside here, you doubtless have heard the famous story about when Lincoln one evening went to Grant's quarters. Grant was out, and he and the War Secretary wanted to see him. And Grant came in, and he passed by the room where Lincoln and his secretary were waiting. They kind of looked at each other, and Grant went upstairs. And Lincoln figured, well, he's going to go up there and freshen up a little. He'll be down pretty soon. And after a while, they came down. The servant came down and said, well, the general has gone to bed. Well, that's a famous story, but according to my student refuse, the general also was suffering from malaria, which he had contracted during that period in the war. So there was something of an excuse after a long, hard day's riding and inspecting and communicating with troops to need to just plop down in bed when you come back home. Now, Lincoln was evolving a doctrine for dealing with the stalemate in Virginia, but he was maturing at the same time a strategy for the operation in the Western armies. Despite the vast area of the Western theater, much, much larger than the Eastern theater, the military goals were comparatively straightforward and unchanging. He had territorial and logistical objectives, but what he really primarily wanted was to control the rivers. The Mississippi River above all else, but East Tennessee, the Virginia railroads, the Cumberland, and the what's the other river? The Ohio River, huh? The Ohio and the Cumberland, and there's another one. What flows into the Ohio in addition to the Cumberland? The Tennessee River. See, when they took Henry and Donald, when Grant succeeded in taking Henry and Donaldson early in 1862, that opened both the Cumberland River and the Tennessee rivers to Union advances. And this is very significant. You see, these water routes, it contrasts. In the Eastern theater, the rivers flow into the Atlantic, and they provide series of defensive lines for the Confederacy. But in the Western theater, they provide avenues of approach, of thrusting in, of invasion for the Union armies, and that's going to be true in the case of all of those rivers. They take the Cumberland, that opens the way to Nashville. They take the Mississippi, that, you see, when they can get the Mississippi, and it's true it takes them until the fall of Vicksburg in July '63 to seize the entire line of the Mississippi. But from an early point, they've got everything except that segment between Vicksburg and Port Hudson, which is just north of Baton Rouge. Once they have got the whole thing, and as Lincoln then says picturesquely, the father of waters once again flows to the sea, they have severed the Confederacy. They can prevent, not totally, of course, every now and then some jerk can sneak across with a small boatload of mail or something like that. But in essence, the Confederacy has been territorially divided. And that's rather significant. Now, this all jived rather well with Scott's earlier overall grand strategic proposal, ultimately called the Anaconda Plan, because the idea was to squeeze the South, have a naval blockade that would cut off the South's ingress and egress, and then put pressure all along the periphery and squeeze the South. Anaconda, of course, is a serpent that squeezes its prey to death. But you add the corollary then of simultaneous advance and thrusting along the waterways. Lincoln's plan is simply a latter-day revising of the Anaconda Plan that Winfield Scott had. So here now Lincoln wants to nurture this strategy. He wants to find generals that are able and willing to carry it out for him. He wants to use, eventually, it takes him a while to come to this conclusion, but he wants to use freed blacks as warriors in his augmented forces. In fact, he announced that the blacks which would be freed by the proclamation would be received into the armed service of the United States to garrison forts, positions, stations, and other places. And he planned for manpower difficulties thus to be significantly eased by tapping this new source of soldiers, as he put it, the great available and yet unavailed of force of force. And of course that proved to be the case, because it is a fact that late in the war, the Union had within its ranks about as many black troops as the Confederates had troops at all. And that was definitely something of a psychological blow, definitely something of a psychological impact. Now, Lincoln was not perfect as commander-in-chief. Sometimes he allowed his generals too much discretion. Maybe even sometimes he caved into political pressure, and he often meddled at the wrong time or failed to do so when the situation called for more positive leadership. He certainly put up with a lot of abuses. Let's make this point. It's not true that Lincoln would relieve a general who disappointed him after the first mess up. Of course, that is true of the first one, McDowell. But it's not true of any of the others. He lets them have 2 times to screw up before he relieves them. But interestingly, I think, after Antietam, and when McClellan had produced his second screw-up, and McClellan is replaced by, who is it, Hooker next or Burnside? Burnside next, and then Hooker. Burnside next. R.E. Lee says, I fear that they are going to keep making changes like this until they finally do get somebody that I don't understand. And that was really prescient. That was exactly right. That was exactly what they did. Lee was able to understand and to counter all those people that he faced, from McDowell to McClellan to Pope to McClellan again to Burnside to Hooker, even to Meade, really, but not Grant. Because Grant knew how Lee's mind worked. And he was able to counter Lee very effectively. And Lee knew that Grant knew that he knew how his mind worked, but there wasn't anything he could do about it. Now, it lasted a good long while, to be sure, but ultimately Grant was the superior general to Lee. And actually, if my major professor was right, Sherman was better than Lee, too. I don't know for sure, but certainly the team of Grant and Sherman was enough to produce the military victory on the field. They worked well together, and they certainly complemented each other. And in all fairness, then we have to say, when Sherman was asked who the war's greatest general was, he said Forrest. He said, that devil Forrest. So, who knows? Jefferson Davis said Stephen D. Lee was the best overall soldier that the war produced, which certainly gave me a bon mot to quote in my biography of that otherwise dull guy. The best overall soldier that the war produced. And he was interesting, you know. I mean, he was hard to make interesting. It was a hard book to write, primarily because the sources were so widely scattered. It required an awful lot of travel and scrounging and skimping here, there, and everywhere. But I finally managed to do that. And, you know, it's amazing what can happen when a person becomes famous. I wrote that book. They didn't print very many copies, although it did win a prize. And it took years to sell out, to all of them to sell out. Now, and see, that was published in '76. You can imagine prices changed a lot over that time. The book cost $12.50 in hardback when it first appeared. And, well, then later I began to become famous. And they sold out the last of the hardback copies, and they didn't too much want to ever put it out in paper anyway, but this is the catalyst that did it. There's a collector's market, and I'm sure almost all of you know, and the prices are, you can, you know, feel around and find out what the price is. And when it hit $50 a copy for the hardback, the press was finally impelled to put it out in paper. And by the time they got it out, it had gotten to $75. And that's about where it remains to this day. I think my Doctoral Offspring number 5 paid about $80 for one fairly recently. But the History Book Club, that was really fascinating. When the paperback came out, the History Book Club adopted it as what they call an HBC classic. I was at a convention in New Orleans rooming with Gary Gallagher, whom at that time I incorrectly thought was my friend, and he found out that this was coming out, and he said, well, gee, I hope people realize that was a young man's book. I don't know what the hell he meant, but I used that as an exam question for years thereafter. Is S.D. Lee, because I also required it as required reading, is S.D. Lee what you would call a young man's book or not, and what do you mean by that? I also, when Rush Limbaugh touched on this a month or so ago, I've never called into a talk show before, but I dialed the number and then got busy signal and pushed redial several times but didn't get through. But they were talking about how a lot of American students don't know where the phrase "from each according to their abilities, to each according to their needs" comes from. Well, I read about that in Playboy magazine about 25 years ago, and ever since then I've been putting that as an exam question on a basic American history test. It's a multiple choice question. The phrase, "from each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs," best reflects the philosophical underpinning of A, the Constitution of the United States, B, the Communist Manifesto, C, none of the above. And inevitably, you'll get 33 1/3% taking each one of those answers. None of them know, and they're all guessing. Of course, the answer is B. But you see, the big problem, and we were chit-chatting about this earlier, that we live in a grossly warped and over-secular society. They aren't teaching anything about religion, and that's 1/3 of all human motivation. God, gold, glory, and the gospel. Money, power, and religion. 1/3. Now, when I taught at West Point in 1991, I loved it. I was permanently spoiled. The students are the most polite, sweet kids on the face of the earth. I would walk in, and the senior cadet president would call the class to order, stand up and salute me and tell me how many were present and how many absent. And then they were just great students, because the D and the F students are not there. They have long since been weeded out before they got to me. But I was lecturing to them on the English Civil War one day, and oh yeah, the parliamentarians this and the royalists this, and I said, now wait a minute, you do know, don't you, that this war has a religious underpinning, and one of the fundamental aims of the parliamentarians is to destroy the Church of England. Oh, no, we didn't know that. Nobody ever told us that. See, so it's pathetic. It's absolutely pathetic. Well, subsequent presidents have benefited from Lincoln's example. As commanders-in-chief, they have consciously or unconsciously followed many of the precepts exemplified in his performance. He strengthened the office of president. Not our first strong president, to be sure, he nevertheless added to our understanding of the term. As a war leader, he provided a quasi-religious inspiration. Whether Lincoln did or did not believe in God is almost beside the point. He inspired a degree of what we call civil religion, and he communicated that to the populace to a commendable degree. There is a clergyman in my denomination that has a history professor slot somewhere that's writing a book that allegedly is going to show that Lincoln had no religious faith whatever. But I was on a week-long symposium at Hillsdale College some years ago, and the son of a man called Peter Marshall Jr. was there, and he delivered a sermon. Actually, he called it a scholarly paper, but it was a sermon. And he talked about how Lincoln was, in fact, a de facto Christian, whether he proclaimed himself to be one or not. He lived as if he were one. Well, in any event, he certainly managed to communicate a religious value to the United States of America, and to inspire the American people to hang in there and bring the victory. Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt emulated very similar evangelistic bents, especially in combining a war effort with forward-looking domestic programs. 4 presidents who succeeded Lincoln approached in their performances similar firmness and resolve in really very trying times. William McKinley, who had to contend with an inept orator politician, Secretary of War Russell Alger, Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt, who both were outstanding commanders-in-chief because they wisely selected generals and then backed them with confidence, not trying to tell them in detail how to do their jobs. Lyndon Johnson. You understand? That's why we lost the Vietnam War, don't you? Lyndon Johnson. There was a career colonel, again, whose name escapes me at the moment, but anyway, he wrote 2 really good books, one analyzing the Vietnam War and one analyzing, Summers, analyzing the Vietnam War and analyzing the first Gulf War, particularly from a Clausewitzian perspective. And he said they did everything right in the first Gulf War, and they did everything wrong in the Vietnam War, and what the generals should have done was to tell the president, by God, you're wrong, and if you don't listen to us, we quit. But they didn't do that. See, they didn't do that. And then Harry Truman, who, like Lincoln with McClellan and Hooker, had general trouble with Douglas MacArthur. In fact, Yeah, Ambrose, you were talking about Steve Ambrose earlier. Ambrose wrote a very good book about how Truman, dealing with MacArthur, preserved the sanctity of the office of Commander-in-Chief for the president. So Lincoln was a bender of the Constitution. He was an overstretcher, to use Thomas Bailey's word, but he observed, too, Bailey did, that Lincoln blazed a trail that followed and improved upon the later comers. Most importantly, Lincoln demonstrated what could be done in persuading the people to accept a momentary expediency in surmounting a crisis. What made Lincoln's example as Commander-in-Chief a great one was his constitutional bending within the framework of a wise, honest, restrained, inspirational conduct that thus did not break the Constitution. Lincoln avoided narrow overemphasis. He understood the difference between distortion and bending, while aiming ultimately to preserve. Lincoln was an effective leader of the American people and of the American military. As Commander-in-Chief, as well as in countless other ways, Lincoln effectively preached to the American people what he felt about the true destiny of the Union, and that is that the cause of the United States is intrinsically a part of fulfilling God's cosmic plan. Well, thanks. So, want to chit-chat now, or you want to wait until the panel discussion? I think everybody wants to wait till the panel discussion.
Okay. We'll start the panel at